everyone. So welcome to the Open Source Days presentation and panel on diversity and inclusion in open source software. I'm very excited to get to talk with everyone about this topic today. So let me start by just talking a little bit about what we're going to be doing today and introduce myself and Carol Payne. So we're going to start this presentation with an update on a new working group that has been formed by the ASWF on diversity and inclusion. Now this working group is being co-chaired by myself, Rachel Rose, and Carol Payne. My regular job is that I am an R&D supervisor at ILM, but I have a really strong passion for diversity and inclusion and really am interested in continuing to work with the ASWF and everyone who is a part of the working group to further that cause. Carol, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Carol Payne, and I am an imaging specialist at Netflix on our creative technologies team. Similar to Rachel, very passionate about the space of inclusion and diversity, and specifically really excited about what we're going to talk about today, about the impact that open source software, I think, can have in the inclusion space, and how we can really tap into that and make that a resource. But in general, yeah, just one of my main focuses throughout my career, and really excited to push it forward.
Awesome. So myself and Carol are going to very quickly update everyone on the working group that we have been forming in the ASWF, and talk a little bit about what our members told us they are interested in having the working group do. In addition, we'll also go over our goals and some of the deliverables that we're planning to do as a part of this working group. That'll be followed with a panel discussion that will include Bridgette Powell, Larry Gritz, and Victoria Long. It'll be moderated by Carol. During the panel discussion, please feel free to enter any questions that you have into the Q&A box within Zoom, and that will come through to me, and I'll be monitoring that Q&A so that at the end, after the questions that Carol has prepared are complete, we can go through some of the questions that all of you have on diversity and inclusion. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about the diversity and inclusion working group for the ASWF. So the ASWF formed this group as a collaborative effort to advance open source software development in the motion picture and media industries. This is really a cross-industry effort and includes everyone who is interested in open source software and in improving the diversity and inclusion across open source software, as well as within the VFX and animation industries. It includes anyone who is interested in joining the working group. It does not have to be someone who is necessarily a programmer, though that is obviously also a great thing, but it can be anyone who is interested in kind of furthering this cause for diversity and inclusion. So far, we have done a number of things to move this working group forward. We have a regular meeting set up every month. It's on the second Wednesday of the month at 1 o'clock in Pacific Standard Time. In addition, we've now already held 3 meetings with about 30 to 40 diverse people being included in each of those meetings. They've actually been really fantastic. Everyone has been very involved and had a lot of really great things to add to the discussion. After our very first meeting, we surveyed our membership to determine what people were interested in seeing out of this working group. And then based on that survey, we drafted a series of goals and deliverables that we have now submitted to the TAC for approval for the official working group. Now, I want to just go through a few of the survey results so you have a better understanding of where everyone was coming from when this group got formed. We had about 30 respondents, and the responses came from a wide variety of locations. So there were people that were coming from all kinds of different companies, which I've included a small selection on the screen. And as you can see, this is a wide range of different companies that are working within the open source, VFX, and animation communities. One of the questions that we asked right away was how familiar folks are with open source software. Again, you can see that this working group very much is spans a wide variety of different people. Some people that are extraordinarily familiar with working with open source software, and other folks who are just getting into it. And we really want to encourage that level of diversity as well. So what age group do you think is the most important to target for increasing diversity and inclusion in open source communities? What we found with this question was that overwhelmingly people were definitely leaning towards college, university, and high school students being the ones who were the key target. If we could really start to talk to college, university, and high school students about this topic, that we should be able to make some improvements in diversity and inclusion within open source software. Another thing we were really interested in was the types of programs that a working group like this should really be trying to target. And so we asked an open-ended question with some suggested topics. The question was, what kind of programs do you think will have the biggest impact on diversity, driving diversity and inclusion? By and far, the #1 answers were mentorship and partnerships. So you'll find when we start talking about our goals and deliverables, these are some of the key points that we have brought into a lot of the things that we're hoping to do as the working group. So let me go ahead and hand this over to Carol, who will be talking through the goals and deliverables that we have drafted up.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So based on the results of the survey, feedback from the group, and both mine and Rachel's and Emily Olin's ideas in the area also, we went together and formed 3 different goals for the group, and then some deliverables that we feel we can reasonably achieve in a year-ish. We're not putting a strict time frame on it yet, but goals and deliverables that we can achieve within the working group so we can measure our progress. The first of those is around student education, and really what that means is these are broad goals, and then the deliverables are how we're going to accomplish it. So this goal is encouraging high school and college students to pursue a career in or participate in open source projects just by education, and tying it back to our film and visual effects and motion picture industries and what an impact open source has on those applications. The second one is around diversity in the foundation itself, working with the different groups in the foundation, as well as the leadership of the ASWF, to talk about what diversity and inclusion means for the foundation and its projects. And then the third one is around resources and guidance for the foundation members, whether that be on an individual basis or a company member basis. Providing those resources and ground truths for our members to educate our colleagues and the industry at large on diversity and inclusion topics, specifically related to open source, but the premises are relatively general. So really being a resource for our members and our community in that area. So based on those 3 goals, we came up with some associated deliverables that we think really tie it back, are things that we're already splitting into subgroups in our meetings to start driving around these different deliverables and what they're going to look like. On the student education front, the first one is a mentorship program, as Rachel noted, targeting high school and or college students. I'm looking at how to tie those back into partnering with ASWF projects and using resources that the Linux Foundation already has available. And then also partnering with external organizations to promote coding and software development. We think that open source is a really awesome opportunity to really get your foot in the door and get familiar with up-to-date and recognized software development practices across the industry. So we're looking for examples of 1 to 2 universities and or organizations with which to work. So if you have suggestions, if you're listening to this call and you think you know a great fit of an organization or a university, no limits on location. We're, you know, a global industry, a global organization. So we're really looking to everyone to help us spread our reach in this area. And the second deliverables are around the diversity in ASWF. And I sort of kind of alluded to this when I was describing the goal, but, you know, working with the TAC and the board to establish some real concrete goals for the ASWF leadership and membership. And then something that we're already starting to work on and get volunteers for is an inclusion ambassador per ASWF project, so that we're linking back each ASWF project to the diversity and inclusion working group. So we have open communication and lines, and that ambassador can work to ensure openness and inclusion in each of our projects and keep that feedback and communication going. And thirdly, around the guidance for members, we're also looking at, we came up with in our last meeting, some great ideas to start a series of blog posts on inclusion topics, starting with things written by the members of our working group, but we're certainly always looking for new topics and new information and all of these things that are so pertinent to all of our areas of work. And secondarily, a landing page for those resources and educational material that we're starting to gather. All of these are in their very initial and infant stage. And so any feedback that you have or anybody has around these goals and these deliverables, we're really interested in hearing everybody's feedback in this area. And the next slide, I think, is along those lines, where to give that feedback. If you have it, obviously you can use the chat right now or the Q&A, but in a more permanent way, if you'd like to get involved, we've got our mailing lists that you can jump on, and then our diversity channel in the ASWF Slack that we're all pretty attentive at, trying to answer questions and stay on track. And then obviously come to our meetings, like Rachel mentioned. Those are the highlights that I wanted to give. Rachel, anything I missed?
No, I mean, I just want to, emphasize that we really are interested in having an excellent, diverse group worldwide that can participate in these conversations and help us drive towards these overall goals. So certainly join the mailing list, join us on Slack, join us for the meetings. The more the merrier. I think that we can make a big difference if we all work together.
I agree. So I think that ends our, we slammed through that. Nice, Rachel, that's great. I think that ends our slide presentation portion of this event. And then when we were talking about, having a session at Open Source Days as a very new group within the ASWF, both Rachel and I felt that it is really important to have an honest discussion about where we think we stand and where we want to go. And so we thought doing a panel with a couple esteemed colleagues that I'm going to introduce would be an awesome way to start to talk about the work we're doing. All three of these panelists are members of the Diversity and Inclusion Working Group already, as well as had long careers already established in the area. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Bridgette Powell. Bridgette's a software engineer at Industrial Light and Magic. She's currently developing pipeline data tools and workflows for artists. She has experience in the feature animation industry in both R&D and production roles. And Bridgette's really inspired, and I'm inspired by her passion for the creative collaboration between artists and engineers. We're really excited to have you, Bridgette. And second is Larry Gritz. Most people are familiar, he's a familiar face in the open source industry. We're really excited to have him here as a resource in our group and on this panel. He's a software engineering architect responsible for software development methodology at Sony Pictures ImageWorks. And like I said, he's got his fingers in many areas of open source, for ImageWorks. He serves as Sony's TAC representative. He's a technical steering committee member and chief architect of Open Shading Language, TSC member of OpenEXR, and lead author of Open Image IO. So, you know, the list goes on, and Larry's everywhere, and so much respect for the work he's done and continues to do for this community. And then thirdly, we have Victoria Long, who is a talent acquisition manager at DNEG. She manages recruitment for DNEG's Vancouver and Los Angeles offices. She's been with DNEG for 7.5 years and has hired crew for over 50 movies, including award-winning shows such as Interstellar, Ex Machina, Blade Runner 2049, and First Man. And Victoria is a big advocate for diversity and inclusion, and is an active member of the DNEG D&I committee, Animation and VFX Alliance of British Columbia D&I committee, and also, like I mentioned, an active and committed member of the ASWF diversity and inclusion effort. So I want to welcome all of you to the panel and kick it off with a fun question for all three of you that I like to ask because of the range of answers we get in this question. But when I say diversity and inclusion, what does that mean to you individually? Anybody would like to start? Maybe Bridgette?
Sure. So what diversity and inclusion means to me? Diversity to me describes what makes each of us unique. So we all came from different backgrounds. We grew up in different areas. I was a military kid, so I moved around a lot and got to experience different cultures. And having those different experiences and those different backgrounds molded our beliefs and our work ethics and things like that. So that's the diversity side of it. And the inclusion side means that we want to try to be representative of people who have those different backgrounds and have those different beliefs, so that when we're working together on projects and initiative, we each have a unique point of view that can tackle how to handle those projects and initiatives in different ways that we would have never thought about if we're working with the same kinds of people that grew up in similar ways as us, then we might be able to handle projects in a new way.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Victoria?
I guess put very simply, diversity is the who and inclusion is the how. Diversity is difference. It's visible and non-visible across so many different things, you know, race, age, political views, gender identity, sexual orientation. It's such a broad area, and inclusion is really how we include that difference. I guess it's a behavior. You know, you can have a really diverse team or company, but if it's not inclusive, then it doesn't work. Yeah, that's my thoughts on D&I.
That's awesome. Last but not least, Larry?
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of my thinking around this sort of stems from just recognizing that, you know, as an industry, you know, it's a creative industry, and it's one that is consumed by everyone of all backgrounds and all around the world. And so it's just glaringly obvious when you look at, you know, who is at the front end, you know, making these things versus who is consuming them. These things are not the same. There's obviously, you know, vastly underrepresented groups, and that it makes no sense. Like, I've never seen anything in my life that makes me think that, you know, the talent and interest in these things should be anything other than more or less randomly sprinkled through the population. And so to me, that means we're missing some of the talent that we need to do the best things. And just from a totally selfish, you know, point of view, like, I'm a consumer of movies. I want to see the best, most creative, you know, films. And I use software, and I want it to be, you know, top. And I work on these things, and I want my coworkers to be, you know, the most interesting, creative, you know, talented people I can find. And so anytime that any of those things don't are sort of suspiciously non-representative of the whole population, I always view that as like some, like some group of extremely talented people that I want to work with and consume the products of their work are somehow being excluded in a way that just makes us all, a little bit poorer for not having them be part of the creative process.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, and at any time, panelists, please, jump in with thoughts and things like that. But going off of some of the things you just said, Larry, we talk about a lot, we say with open source software that it's open to all, and it's really, anybody can participate, anybody can contribute. But if we actually dive down into reality, we come across the same unseen systemic barriers to entry for people of underrepresented backgrounds as in any other organization. Wanted to talk with you, Larry, specifically, but everybody else, about how we make space for these groups. We talked, a lot about this throughout, but love to hear your opinion.
You want me to start with that one?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, the reason that I think open source has a particularly big contribution to make is that a lot of the, like it should, on paper, it should be ideally, posed to not have these limitations and be extra inclusive and much more, meritocratic. Like lots of the things that lead to the sort of implicit biases that might make someone's resume not get seen, or, people come away from an interview with a sort of fuzzy, oh, they're not quite like me, do I really want to hire them? Like, a lot of that gets swept away because much of the open source development process, it's remote. You're not, seeing people. There's usually sort of some, objective, aspect of it, like the code works or it doesn't. It makes the project better or it doesn't. So on paper, it's all, the theory is it should be like the most even, playing field that we should see in anything that we do. But in practice, if you actually look at the people who are the most active participants, like you look at the technical steering committees of our own projects, as much as we're all committed to this, and they're very uniform looking, right? So, we have to get our own, house in order there too. And it's very tricky. I think that part of it is just sort of, correlation, like, sort of diversity aside, if you look at the people who are like in the leadership circles of these projects, they're also the same people who are kind of high up in those organizations. They're also the same people that you see, on the DigiPro, program committee. They're also the same people that you see, in the SciTech Awards process. You're like, we keep running into the same people, including people on these calls. And so I think there's this heavy networking effect where once you're kind of in with this crowd, those are the same people that you see at all of these kind of influential groups. And so I think if you can crack any one of them to pull people in who are not already part of that, that in crowd, I think that not only is a direct contribution, but it also gets them feet in with all of these other sort of important industry activities and professional development opportunities. And so I like the phrase you said about making space. I think all of these groups, if you asked everybody, they would all say that not only would they allow, but they crave, more diversity and inclusion. But putting that into practice is a lot more difficult. And I think it takes people doing things like saying, yeah, sure, I'm an obvious choice to be on this panel or whatever, but actually I want to pull in, this developer, over here who hasn't done that, but I know they're capable of doing it. Maybe they wouldn't even think to volunteer themselves, but you have to, take yourself out a little bit and push some other people in who are ready for that step, and help to sort of push that process along and be inclusive in a sort of more active way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. Of like it has to be actionable. It has to be purposeful. It can't be, anything that I've learned of, inclusion and diversity efforts over the years is it cannot be passive. It's not just going to happen, overnight or by accident of things like that. If we want to specifically in leadership roles increase that visibility and that diversity, it has to be, you have to decide to do it and actively do it. Victoria, or sorry,
than I've made it out to be too, right? Like it's the step of going from having that sentiment to putting it into process is actually really difficult because, it's a pipeline problem, right? I mean, oftentimes the willingness to sort of make that room and pull people in, executing on that depends on having those next people, that line of people who is ready to move in and take up, those positions and those opportunities. And that's why, I think a lot of the craving that was revealed from the surveys is you almost have to get people early in their careers and before they've started their careers to sort of get on those paths and think, yeah, I could do that. And so then when those opportunities, come up that we can make room, there are people there to fill those slots. And quite often that's the tricky part.
I think when we talk about sort of making space, I think it's definitely a group effort. I train hiring managers on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias, and the need to be really aware of your biases because we all have them. It feels probably very uncomfortable to admit it, but it's a fact. Human beings are wired that way. And it's very easy for me to sort of, talk through hiring managers and let them know that, we like to hire people who are like ourselves. Again, that's a fact. It feels really comfortable to do that. But also I think it's really important just for anyone, whether you make decisions about who's hired into a team or you make decisions about who's promoted, it's everything. It's about, you're part of a team and you choose who you want to collaborate with, right? And again, you're still probably making those decisions. Well, I choose to collaborate with this particular individual because they're like me, right? They're like me, they look like me, they think the same as me, and it feels really comfortable. So what I'm saying is to try and get yourself out of that comfort zone and work with people that typically maybe you wouldn't always choose to collaborate with. And I think everyone has to be aware of their biases, whether you're someone in a company making decisions or whether you are just part of the team. If everyone's aware of it, then you can start thinking about making steps to kind of, counteract it. I don't think there's a cure for unconscious bias, but I think people should be aware of it. And the moment you start thinking about it in every situation, whether you're, it doesn't have to be in an interview, you could just be in a meeting with team members, how you include other people, that one person that isn't speaking in a meeting. Why don't you encourage them to say, well, what's your thoughts, and make sure that everyone has a voice. But I think it's really important for us to all encourage each other in those situations.
That's great. Yeah. Along those lines of, we hit on a couple things, but I'm wondering, Bridgette, if you can single out anything or many things that you think would have helped you earlier in your career along these lines.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I would have loved in college is to have more hands-on experience with practicing software practices and in real life. Things like doing feature development and then testing your code and learning how to deploy it and push things. And we do a lot of those things in school as like isolated classes. Like we were working on a class project, you typically just put it in a zip file and upload it to the class website, or you learn about testing, or you learn about back-end like database systems, but we never really put it all together. And I think one of the things that I would love to see from the Academy Software Foundation and the open source community is reaching out to universities and building some kind of independent study or a class that encourages people to learn about these workflows. And even like working with other people remotely. That's kind of taken everybody by storm right now because of COVID. But like Larry said, working in an open source project allows you to learn how to do that, like learning how to work with people that are remote from you, and how do you talk to people, how do you reach out to, how do you schedule meetings and ask for help. So I think that would be a really great thing that I would like to see come out of this, which is one of our deliverables that you presented.
Yeah, that's great. I agree on the, the remote aspect of it is fascinating, because theoretically, open source should, like Larry was talking about, remove a lot of those barriers of you don't have to be in a specific physical location, and you don't have to, have a subset of experience and resume to get involved. And it's how do we tap into that and make it accessible and make it a part of that. And I see, those mentorship opportunities as a huge way to do that. As you start small and you build it from there until we have something that, we can pilot out to a bunch of different universities and make a big impact. But right. A lot of those, and there's, we don't have to move on from this specifically if you guys have more thoughts, but I was also thinking in terms of, we were talking about the impact of, key development moments and good mentors for ourselves, and sort of spotting those behaviors and encouraging them. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to jump in and talk about that, or has an example of some great mentorship and how that affected you. No?
Well, I know one of the things for me, I've been involved with mentoring others for the past couple of years. ILM has allowed me to do that, which I think is also a really great point that other companies should also try to do, is making space for people to do these things. One of the efforts that I was able to do allowed us to talk to students, just exposing them to the film industry. And I think if more students had exposure to just knowing what's out there, then it would open a lot more doors for them to even say or think that it's possible to get into roles that are related in film.
I think when it comes to mentorship, I think, what I think is really important is to encourage our diverse developers and leads, and encourage them to be a bit more visible, so people have, especially grads and sort of junior developers, so they have more sort of diverse role models, and hopefully eventually mentors, but that's not always simple. It's about kind of just encouraging those members to maybe kind of be in the spotlight a little bit more. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm kind of curious to hear from the other panelists, since we're on the topic of sort of mentorship. What would you advise, either for people looking to be mentored, or people who want to be helpful mentors, or companies who want to set up that? What have you seen in your places of work or other experience that you have that make for good or bad habits in those directions? And what advice would you give people, who sort of, they want to contribute in that way, but they're not quite sure how to start?
For me, regular meetings for sure are the baseline. It's easy. I know when I first wanted to be a mentor in college and wanted to help other students that were younger than me, when you first do it, you're like, okay, we'll set up a meeting every month or so. And then sometimes the mentee would forget about the meeting, or they wouldn't show up for whatever reason. So I think getting on a cadence and making sure that baseline regular meetings are happening is the first step. And it's really important to make sure that that doesn't fall off. But then once you have established those meetings, then learning what that student wants to get out of their career, what they want to learn, would help guide you and help steer them into whatever career path that they want. If they're interested in film, then you could talk about more of your career pathways. If they're not, then maybe something that's tangentially related to how you got to where you were, I feel like is also really helpful. And just watching other panels, for me personally, I love when people talk about their personal journey. And I like when they give concrete examples, even if it means that I don't want to be in that exact position that they're at, but at least learning how they got to how they got to that position. Like what classes did you take? Like what role were you in when you first graduated? And like learning that specific journey is still super helpful, because it kind of helps you understand how that person thought about those career decisions. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. And I'll be the first to say that I don't think I would be in the career that I'm in without good examples of mentorship. You know, a lot of the behaviors that I see and then I try and emulate is, you know, that mentorship is, whether formal or informal, you know, both types work, a two-way street. And it has to be, you know, the mentee being active and seeking information, but also the mentor being open and available and offering to give that information. So a lot of the time, for me, what that looks like is if, you know, you get a question in a space from someone that, you know, might be a potential mentee, just opening that door and asking, are you interested in learning more? Would this, you know, would you like more information on this topic? Or if you have any other questions, I'm here, I'm available. And, you know, setting that open door and making that a priority, often for me, I found is all it takes a lot of the time to make that space that we've been talking about. Yeah, along those same lines, you know, we're looking, Victoria, around like open source as an entry point to the industry. Do you feel like that's something that, you know, companies like DNEG and other companies could take advantage of from a recruitment perspective too, as a true entry point to the industry?
Yeah,
to help with that.
Yeah, hugely, because I mean, open source is sort of the perfect networking opportunity. So it's quite interesting, you know, we're very active in going to university job fairs, and, you know, what we tend to do is, you know, it isn't necessarily just talking about DNEG. What we're doing is we're introducing the industry, and we're introducing the industry to comp sci students and saying, look, have you ever considered using your coding skills on movies? And for the most part, many of them haven't. And, you know, I think we stick out like a sore thumb amongst, you know, in a job fair, you know, people kind of come to us and there's a big screen with all these movies, and they head to us because I think we're always the odd one out. And it's always really appealing to them. I think one of the common questions that students ask is, well, this all sounds really incredible. You know, how can I learn more? And what can I do to kind of expose myself to the industry and start learning things? You know, there isn't necessarily a module that I'm doing you know, in my course that is about, you know, computer graphics, but, you know, what can I do on the side while I'm studying? And our advice is usually, you know, download some 3D software. You know, there's kind of some really good free, you know, student stuff that you can download, you know, sort of, you know, dabble in that, create kind of cool tools and just experiment, right? But actually what we should be doing is saying, and there are these amazing open source projects that you can be part of. And by doing that, you're networking with new people. And the very best way is to, you know, expose your work to the people who are in the industry. There is no better way for you to get known by getting involved in projects. It's the very best. Otherwise, you know, you can just apply for a job when you graduate, you can apply for an internship. But if you've been working with one of the developers at DNEG, then they're going to be saying to me, by the way, there's this, you know, great student I've been working with on this project. keep an eye out for them on the next co-op or on the next junior software engineering role that we have. So to me, it's the perfect way for that step, into the industry. We first step into a job.
For the employers, it's also such a risk mitigation strategy to recruit from these places. Like, how many times have you been in an interview and you're looking at someone and you've got like an hour to try to kind of guess, like, what would they be like as a developer, and your staff, do they really know what they're doing? What do they like to work with? What's their communication style? Are they having a good day today or a bad day today in the one narrow slice of time I have with them? But if they were someone who'd been participating on a project that matters, to your company, like, you've probably had a chance to observe them over a long period of time and know for reals, like, what are they capable of? What do they know? What does their code look like? What's their communication style like, with the senior developers and the angry users? Like, all of that stuff that you guess at in an old-fashioned interview, it's just all out there and known if you're recruiting from participants in open source projects that you care about.
Yeah, and working on those group project settings, I think, is a really good learning experience as well. Because when, just going back to talking about working on class projects, like, you either have the experience of being on a really good team and everybody's doing their work and you actually learn something out of it, to like people who, like, there's only one person that ends up doing all the work and you don't really know what's going on. And then also being in a situation where you don't have a team. Like, I've been in this situation where people are like, I don't want to work with you. And they just, it's like this low-key competitive environment in college already. And so if you have the opportunity to work with people who do really, they want to teach you and you want to learn, it's this mutual beneficial experience that you get out of that only benefits both of you long-term, both for the person mentoring you and the company that they work for, and you actually learning something that that's useful.
Yeah, and I think it's, we've talked a lot about, we're the Academy Software Foundation, but also want to take a second to make sure to point out that, I'm not a software developer true by trade. I dabble and I write, and sure, I can code, but most of I want to make sure and highlight too that within the ASWF, because of its connections to, creativity, the film and VFX industry, that there's so many opportunities to get involved, because the reality is these open source projects are used so heavily by every major film these days, every small film these days, even whether you know it or not. And so there's opportunities to get involved and get familiar with the softwares that are being used. And we need the teams need feedback. They need people to test. They need people to just, say whether their documentation makes sense. And there's gaps, because there's a huge amount of things that happen as people that are developing these projects are so close to them that it takes someone new coming in and looking at it and from a fresh perspective and saying things that aren't immediately obvious to people that are so close to these projects. And it's a huge thing and an opportunity that we're frankly missing in a lot of these projects right now. And so whether you're a software developer is a key component, but not the only one. And that's the cool already, diverse nature of our industry in a lot of ways that I think is just amazing.
I was gonna say, I think, when we talk about, our industry and our companies and the different roles that are available and the different career routes, it's so broad. It's everything from being really super creative to being really, really technical, and then of course everything in between. And I think that's what students are really interested in hearing about, saying, well, actually, I may not be the best coder, but I love doing this, or I'd love to lead projects and be the one that's, scheduling everything. And that's really important, for us to find, the future project managers and leads. So there are so many different opportunities that we can talk about.
Yeah, it's really great. Along those lines, I want to give each of you some time to, just talk about what you really think that the ASWF our working group can contribute in open source software. If there's anything that we've, sort of missed that you're truly passionate about. What do you think we can do now? What do you think the long term looks like?
I think working on the goals that we've set is going to be what determines the success of the software foundation. I think we do have those. I feel really passionate about reaching out to universities and the mentorship aspect of that. And so proving that that is a worthwhile thing to do is going to be the first hurdle, I guess, to get over.
I would say just being visible everywhere, but not just in the very obvious places. As Larry said earlier, we're used to attending, the DigiPros and the SIGGRAPHs, and you see the same, group of people there every year, and that's great. But we have to be visible in groups or events that we're just not used to attending, and really broaden our networks. And I think that's the key thing is exposure, but just with a much broader outreach.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, as being in places where you wouldn't normally think to be.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. So thank you guys for this discussion. We want to continue it, but we want to start to take some questions from the Q&A. And so Rachel's going to help us facilitate that. She's been watching it, but jump in and answer on any of these questions that we have from the audience as well.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of great questions in the Q&A. We also have a really good discussion going on in the chat window. So I'll just try to come up with what might be the next thing for us to talk about. To start with one of the questions, there was some conversation in a Q&A about how one company was working on a series of D&I working sessions over the next couple of months. And he asked if we could pick only a couple of ideas to implement at a company to promote D&I. What would be your choices for best starting points?
I would say for me, it would be what Victoria was saying, is like try to find a conference that you wouldn't normally attend. For me personally, I always point to when I went to the National Society of Black Engineers, and DreamWorks was there, DreamWorks Animation, and that's how I got to talk to an HR representative and a couple of engineers that were there representing DreamWorks in the film industry. Otherwise, I probably would have never been able to have any kind of access to it at all. So even having the opportunity to talk to someone and have them look at my resume was fantastic to me. So things like that, like find a different conference that's not SIGGRAPH or DigiPro that you wouldn't normally go to, would be a starting point.
Awesome.
I would say, sorry, I was just going to say that the big one for me, if you could only pick two things, talk about unconscious bias. I bang on about it, but it's so important. I think it's really interesting, and I think that day-to-day people just don't think about it. So if you really create that awareness across your teams, then people can start thinking about it more day to day in meetings, even in code reviews. There's just examples for absolutely everything where unconscious bias is active.
I think if you look at across a lot of our organizations, these companies, if you look at the sort of hiring of engineers, the junior level hires that we make, it's not perfect, but it's not half bad either. We do okay there a lot of the time. And then if you look at the leads, that's a much narrower and less diverse looking group. And if you look at like the really senior people, that's even narrower than that. So, I think if you were just going to do one or two things, sort of bang for the buck wise, I think that maybe a really high value would be trying to put some of these, sort of mentorship or buddy system kind of things in place so that you can cultivate, your recruiting and your junior staff into staying, making sure that they are, shuffled onto the worthwhile projects, and rising up in the organization, and then also then turning into the mentors for that next generation too. Like I like a lot of the university and even below recruiting initiatives, but those are longer term. But we're all starting out with a lot of raw material to work with in our companies already. But I think making an extra effort to make sure that they are cultivating their careers and getting the choice assignments that will help their professional development is really, I think in terms of like results for effort, is probably very high up there, is my suspicion.
I'd say, a related question to what you were just talking about, Larry, not exactly the same, but somewhat similar. There was a question in the Q&A from Cheryl where mentioning that we had talked about how there was a focus on college-age students for the working group, and that this seemed like the right group to focus on. But she also wondered whether there might be some focus on career changers as well, ways to kind of promote folks moving from one area of an industry into another to get into this type of open source related and software development related work. Do you guys have any thoughts or ideas about that?
Yeah, I think trying to think sort of from one industry to another that's definitely one thing, but I would say just promotions altogether. One thing that I've been talking to managers about at DNEG is, again, reassessing the process for promotions. I think that's really, really important. I think that there has to be a very robust process in place for when you choose who you promote into leadership roles. I think people need to rethink sometimes what a lead or a good manager are. I think people always assume that, the one that has the loudest voice and always speaks up in meetings is of course going to make the best leader. That's not true at all. I think it's about approaching people in the team, whether they are interested in being a leader or manager one day, and giving them the right training, the right exposure to that. And just really opening it up that everyone has an opportunity to apply for that role, and be considered and be given the right leadership training to enable them to achieve those goals.
Any other thoughts on that one?
I'm sure any of the rest of you who have had the unconscious bias kind of training and other things have probably heard the same thing. I'm going to mess these numbers up because I'm just trying to recall it from memory, but there's a sort of stereotypical behavior out there where, if you have a list of requirements to apply for a job or to get a promotion that you want, so the stereotype goes, and I think there's truth to this, the typical man will apply for that promotion if they think they have about half of the qualifications that it calls for, and say, I'll get in, and then I'll show them I can do the rest of the stuff. I know I can do it. And but if you ask, a typical woman who is equally, qualified, very frequently, she perhaps won't even apply for the position until she has every one of the check boxes completely nailed, right? And so I think you have to sort of, and this happens at every level, right? It happens in the apply to come into the company. It happens in the, okay, I'm there. Should I, be agitating to be on this project that I think is going to be really important? It happens at the, how do I become a lead level? At all of these, choices. So I think, sort of changing the culture so that it isn't always the, the person who, like you said, is the loudest, or maybe would you need to pull in the people who are qualified, but maybe they wouldn't take that leap and make sure that they're being considered, they're being put in those positions, because that's, that's a big portion of the talent that's there for the taking.
That makes perfect sense. It actually reminds me of something I'd mentioned to Carol a little while ago, where even internally talking about career changes, I've had a lot of people in my 13 years at ILM ask me to teach them to program, artists who asked me to teach them to program, but they were all what you might consider the typical, the not diverse individual, and where I think many of the more folks who might fall in one of those diversity categories would also be interested in it, but might not reach out to do it. So I feel like that is a really great point. There's one other great question in here that I want to definitely get to, which is that most people are already super stressed with their workload, deadlines, low budget, etc. Do you think it is an issue of free time for people of diverse backgrounds to be able to get involved? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I could, it's a thing I think a lot about, and I think that there's two angles to it, and it goes back to something I said earlier, is that this work is purposeful, and this work is a choice, but it also needs to come from the top down. And so, if you're doing this work in relation to your company specifically, that it has to be a company-led initiative, and your company should be making time for you to participate in these efforts. And it should be tied in this day and age to, if you're a manager or in a leadership role, it should be tied to your job performance to a large extent, because we've all seen the relation to how companies and organizations and people perform better when they're in representative situations where it's inclusive and diverse, and you have other people that look like you and or act like you or similar to you, and you're not the odd person out. And it promotes better working environments and more productive people in general. And there's been many studies that have shown that. So I think if I were in that situation and feeling like I didn't have, the bandwidth or the time in my company specifically, it's a little different in open source software, where sometimes it's not company sponsored. But in general with my company, if I was feeling that way, it would be a conversation that I would start with my manager, and really start to, take that on and have that conversation as a starting point of, I feel this is important and I'd like to contribute in it, but I don't have time. I don't feel I have time. Can we make time?
And I should also say that, this is why we have committees. I'm part of various D&I committees, and we all have something that's come up, and, someone's, doing crunch time at the end of a project and they just cannot spare a single minute. But that's fine, because the people that do have some time will take on, doing a panel or doing an event, and then they'll come in the next time when I'm really busy. I'm like, okay, I need to step out of this one, and then it's kind of over to you. And that's how the committee works. So, you don't need to commit 24/7. You can kind of dip in and out, and there might just be one project that you lead, or you are really passionate about one area. And then, when things are insane for you, then that's fine. You just concentrate on that. So there's ways to work around that.
So we are getting very close to time, so we probably should wrap this up. I feel like I could talk about this for another hour, though. There's been a lot of really great conversation in this panel, and I want to thank the panelists, Bridgette, Larry, and Victoria. Thank you very much for joining us today. This has been fantastic. We've also had some really great conversation in the chat. There was actually a wonderful suggestion of providing on our page with the working group, where we're providing guidance to our members, of trying to bring in some guidance around running meetings where people may have disagreements, perhaps about code, and how do you make that a welcoming environment, so that someone of a diverse background is not immediately turned off. I think that's a great topic, and wish we could have actually talked about that right now. But I did want to just mention that came up. We're really interested in getting more people involved, so please, join our mailing list, join us on Slack, continue the conversation with us. Everyone on here will be more than happy to continue. Anything to add, Carol?
No, I think that's great, and thanks everybody. I really enjoyed talking with you all today, and look forward to more conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was good fun. Thanks.
Thanks. This is great.
Well, bye everybody. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Bye.